function of the government of Canada going forward, what we need to deliver to support government priorities, as well as how we actually structure our procurements. So what's important here is when you think about procurement, there's approximately 450,000 transactions that are procurement related done on an annual basis across the government of Canada. At PSPC, we do approximately 16,000 of these transactions, which roughly translate into the contracts. It's not a perfect one-to-one because there's amendments and other elements. And so while we do a very small percentage of PSPC as a contract authority of the government's procurement function, the rest is done under department's own authorities and their own contracting authorities and financial authorities. But those that we do actually represents about $20 billion a year of procurement on a basis, on an annual spend of the government of Canada, which I believe is around $34 billion.
So what could the impact be if the delegated authority wasn't in place and everything had to go through the minister?
It would not be doable. If you just look at the volumes, the risk, the complexity, the training a procurement officer has to be able to challenge function, to be able to ensure that a file is properly documented, it would just be impossible. In many instances, files of a certain volume, complexity, risk go to Treasury Board, and even that is a challenge to be able to try to keep up with the volume. And it would. I'll just pause here, Dominique.
I fully agree with the deputy. I would say that ultimately Canadians wouldn't get the service that they deserve from the Canadian government. It would stall the entire machine.
Okay, so PSPC has suspended the task or authorization authority for all 87 departments and agency it contracts for when it comes to IT professional services, not just for CBSA, not just for the companies involved in the RICAM, but everybody. PSPC is negotiating new agreements with these departments and agencies to ensure more rigor in contracting. Can you tell us about what will be different in these new agreements versus how things were done previously?
Thank you very much for the question. And before I turn to Dominique, I do want to say that I think this is really important that the ground set that the reason we're doing this across the professional services, IT staff augmentation, and in general how we manage task authorizations is that the comments that came from the report were around the actual tool and making sure that we're using it to ensure that there is best value, clear deliverables, so that we're able, when we do get audited or when we want to go back and look at the decision making, there's a clear evidentiary trail. So we decided that we need to really look at it across the whole commodity to make sure that we were providing best value in the procurement process. Dominique?
Yeah, no, very good point have been raised. So in addition, what we want to make sure that we stay away from broad general task description and ensuring that the required skill set is not too wide. So this is also to response to the Auditor General Recommendation 1.73 that was formulated to PSPC. Improving the evaluation requirement, basically making sure that when we look at CVs, it's not only basically at the contract award stage, but also at the TA stage, and also making sure that, and I did allude to that we get from the client actual evidence of the CVs of the resources that are being proposed, that those resources attest of the accuracy of their experience, and that also they provide their authorization to use the CV by a bidder or supplier. So all those steps in addition are being taken. Greater transparency, I would say. We want also to know who are going to be the subcontractor that are going to be used. So what are in terms of daily rate they're going to be providing. So there's new requirements that are all incorporated into what we call the task authorization checklist that has now become mandatory to use our tool, our supply arrangement. So if client did not comply with this new tool, they're not going to be able to use that. So that will bring a lot of additional discipline in terms of that, making sure that tasks are clearly defined. It's linked also to a specific outcome. Security requirements are being met, so there are also requirements for security requirement. So tons of new requirements, and when we're dealing with contract amendment, we want to make sure that there's a true reason for that contract amendment. Is the scope increasing? So what are the reason? And what's the obligation to proceed? So our officers are going to be performing much more challenge in future that they've been in the past. and not only basically being satisfied that they asked the client, but looking at the actual evidence that it is provided, and most importantly, and this was also outlined by the Auditor General, that everything is documented. So we're going to be putting a lot of emphasis on proper documentation, so that would help, and we're also leveraging our new EPS, so electronic procurement system.
Thank you. I appreciate it. That went over, but I wanted to make sure we had a fulsome answer from you and your department. Turning now to encore une fois, Mr. Lemire.
Mr. Lemire, you have 2.5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson. Let's talk about Dalian. The CEO and founder of the firm was both a private consultant and a public servant, according to La Presse. The value of the contracts obtained by Dalian since 2018 are billions of dollars, $3 billion from national defence, based on the public accounts data. The department didn't clarify whether Mr. Yao had been suspended with or without pay for during an internal investigation. According to La Presse, they double-dipped as both a public servant and a contract worker. In a contracting process involving companies like Dalian, I understand that there are no checks that are made. This is a company that has contracts with the government since 2018 to the tune of over $50 billion, and the CEO is a public servant. How do you explain that?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, right off the bat, it's important to understand that there are multiple codes, ethics codes. We have a responsibility as a supplier has a responsibility under Code of Ethics codes.
Their responsibility. They have, as a public servant, you have, as a condition of employment, a requirement to declare your conflicts of interest. So on that side, I believe that this committee has asked colleagues from the Department of Defense to come and speak to the actions that they're taking. But I think it's very important in terms of a general response to understand that the system is we have a framework to prevent and detect and respond to conflicts of interest. So many different measures and triggers have been put in place by this. When we know about it, we act on it. The onus is on both the public servant and the contractor to be able to disclose any potential conflicts. This is a very unusual situation. I believe that we've been asked to come back and provide more detail on other similar cases that we know about. And I just want to close by saying that at PSPC,
Therefore, I'd just like to add one thing. In the course of the last year, we have laid off 5 employees who failed to declare a conflict of interest. And we fired 5 of them. And each and every time we lay someone off for public service wrongdoing, it's on the open data site of the Government of Canada that it's published. So you do this verification after the fact and not when you hire the individual. Response: when we hire a person, before you sign your letter of offer, you have to fill out a form that states your conflicts of interest, and at that point, a decision is made.
Next up again, Ms. Lidout, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I am Ms. Idlout, just so that I can help you.
Yes, thank you. Idlout, yes. I stumbled there again, but Idlout. Thank you very much.
Okay, as I said in my earlier opening statement, I said that I was shocked that the Arrive Cam app was awarded to a business that claimed to be Indigenous. So I want to ask about the procurement process. But first, I would like to ask the Deputy Minister if it's a priority of this government to ensure that Indigenous businesses and entrepreneurs receive contracts. If so, can the Deputy Minister explain why?
Thank you very much for the question. This is indeed a very key deliverable of the Government of Canada as it relates to procurement, as it relates to truth and reconciliation, as it relates to some of the work that's been done at Parliament and various committees and some of the reports that have come out. Putting a floor of putting a 5% set aside or 5% of the Government of Canada's spend on procurement going to Indigenous firms is a goal that the government is actively pursuing. As part of that, the Indigenous Services Canada, the Department of Indigenous Services of Canada, has a directory of Indigenous suppliers that have qualified so that when the government is looking to fulfill various goods and services and looking to procure solicitation documents, that directory is consulted, and we make targeted efforts in various communities across Canada and various First Nations to try to use economic levers to encourage various Indigenous SMEs to come and compete to federal procurement opportunities.
Did anyone in the department or did the deputy minister check to see if the recipient of this contract was a part of that registry?
Thank you very much for the question. Officials that were looking at the contracting did confirm with the Indigenous Services Indigenous Services Canada that they were a member in good standing on the Indigenous Business Directory. That being said, we did ask them to carry out further audits as more and more information came to light, and that audit is underway with colleagues in Indigenous Services Canada.
Did anyone contact Alderville First Nations to verify that Mr. Yeo is a member of that community?
Thank you very much for the question. I believe this is underway with Indigenous Services Canada.
Thank you. That is your time. Next up, we have Mr. Genuis. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Just picking up on the issue of Indigenous procurement. Dalian's identity as an Indigenous company as part of the set-aside for Indigenous procurement is obviously absurd and a manipulation of the intention of the policy. The intention of the policy presumably is to give opportunities to Indigenous Canadians to be able to work in jobs that flow from government procurement. But this was a company that simply received contracts and subcontracted them, taking a cut along the way. There were no opportunities created for Indigenous people as a result of this. You mentioned a registry or a list of Indigenous companies that are used when considering this 5% set-aside. What percentage of those companies actually create jobs for Indigenous peoples in Canada?
Thank you very much for the question. I actually don't have that information. I will refer the question to Indigenous Services Canada. There's about 2,600 companies on that list in various commodity areas.
Okay, I think we need to get further information at this committee or elsewhere about to what extent those companies should really qualify in terms of the actual objective of the policy, creating opportunities for Indigenous Canadians. Ms. Reza, I want to ask you about staff augmentation. You spoke at the Government Operation Committee about this. You said, quote, traditionally staff augmentation works in a similar manner where you bring in a temp agency and they're taking on the burden of finding the resources. There are many shops that do this across the system, so there are about 635 IT firms that provide staff augmentation resources. So Canadians have become familiar with 3 companies, Corodex, Dalian, and GC Strategies, that receive work and subcontract, often without providing any actual value themselves. But this is an incredible number. We're not just talking about 3 companies, 635 companies. So why is this practice of multi-level subcontracting so common that there are 635 different companies that are doing it?
Thank you very much for the question. First off, there's 635 companies that provide task-based IT professional services. So in terms of why there's so many, I mean, the Government of Canada has various priorities that need to be filled by niche skill sets on IT professionals. In terms of your question about...
Sorry, but just to clarify, these are folks doing staff augmentation, which you defined before the Government Operations Committee, not as doing the actual IT work, but as doing the work of finding people who can do the work. So why can't the Government of Canada just kind of maintain a database of